Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 5th Sunday in Lent for the week of April 6th, 2025, and excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are getting near to the end of Lent, but yet we're still in the midst of Lent. It's one of these moments, and I think a little bit ties into where we'll be going a little bit this week. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We don't want to look back too much. We need to stay in the moment, but still be anticipatory of what is coming. And so it's this weird spot that we are in within the liturgical calendar right now. And that angst, that urgency, that, what is this? I think is part of the Lenten season. It's part of what we should be trying to go through, to work through, because that's part of what Christ was going through. This aspect of what is all going on, what does this all mean? But yet Christ knowing where it was going toward also just adds this other anticipatory, but also hardship that comes when we're trying to balance all of this within the Lenten season. But before we get into that, I think we have to look back to last week's questions, which were, what blessings have you often overlooked? And what changes in your life have you questioned but ended up benefiting others ahead of yourself? And we had a really great conversation a little bit coming back to the idea of how when we switch jobs or move locations, what does that actually mean? What does that actually do? And how that can impact multiple different people around the areas in which you're in, the scope in which you're in. I think we can see this as a larger scope of like when we look at professional athletes and when they switch teams and how that can be very hard and damaging to a fan base, but also really empowering for the one that's coming to. So this aspect of how we can have impact on people, I think is a large thing that I think we often overlook. I know for me, when I was stepping out of active ministry, if you want to put it that way, when I was leaving the church that I was in, that was one of the things that I really was thinking about was the impact that I had had on multiple different kids and what that was going to mean for them and how is that going to affect me as well. This relationship that you end up making by doing these types of things, I think, leaves a lasting impression, not only with the kids, but also with yourself. And so I think there's this aspect of when we are walking through life that's sometimes very difficult to quantify. And especially in a world where we talk about just moving on to bigger and better things, I think there's times we have to also be able to recognize and acknowledge that there are things that are hard to quantify that aren't maybe dollars and cents, that aren't maybe just easy to quantify. The impact that we can have on others, I think, is one of them. And I think that's a major thing that we should be thinking about and considering as we're moving forward. So let's just jump into it here. The Old Testament text then is from Isaiah chapter 43, verses 16 to 21. This is one of these moments where the Lord is reminding us about what has happened in the past, where God has provided for God's people and making the paths straight and providing water and making sure that the people of Israel, as they were wandering around in the desert, were provided for. But also don't get hung up on that. Coming from verse 18, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. This idea then how God continues to provide and brings forth in ways that we don't necessarily anticipate. So this idea of how we need to be able to recognize and remember what God has done, but don't expect that's the exact same way that God's going to do it. And in doing so, it allows us to be able to actually move forward and recognize that God is going to continue to provide for us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 126, all 6 verses of it. And this is, again, this reminder of how God has done great things for God's people. It has continued to bring laughter to the tongues and shouts of joy among the nations, recognizing the great things that the Lord has done, and we have rejoiced in that. and that when there has been tears, they also lead to shouts of joy. When there has been weeping, there has also been these things that have also led to joy within the people. So this recognition of how God continues to make sure, as long as we are following, that we are continuing to be in this place of joy, continuing to be in this place of giving God praise for what has happened. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Philippians chapter 3, verses 4b to 14. So this is an interesting little moment here on Paul, that we get a little bit of the background of who Paul is, and recognizing that Paul can trace Paul's lineage to the tribe of Benjamin and was perceived as this highly officiating figure within the law, the Pharisees, and was a zeal for that. But then recognizing how then Paul gave that all up for the sake of the gospel. What Paul is getting at with this is the idea that within how the people were arranged at that time, the tribes of Israel, being able to have where there was prestige in who Paul was. But yet, because he was following the letter of the law, he had been persecuting the Jews, which then also became the early Christians, based on the fact of how they were doing things. Paul then converts to the faith, and that's where we start getting from verses 8 to 14 on how in all of this, I had all these things, and recognizing that that wasn't valuable. That wasn't worth anything. What is worth something is recognizing what Christ did for me and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what does that mean for me now? And as I continue to strive to understand that and bring that forth toward people, that is where my true prize is recognizing what Christ did for me. And thus that being the driving force, not what I have been perceived to be. And from the history of who my family has been, do I get this wealth of insight and be looked at with favor. So this recognition on how Christ is the one that is worth the bragging rights, not our own name. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 12, the first 8 verses of it. And this is 6 days before the Passover. Jesus comes to the house of Lazarus, who, remember, he is risen from the dead, and he's having dinner. There is Martha, who is serving them, Lazarus, and Mary. And Mary then takes nard, which is a type of floral perfume, and anoints Jesus' feet and wipes her hair to clear them off his feet, and it fills the whole place. Judas the Iscariot, one of the disciples who will betray Jesus, questions, why is she doing this? This could have been easily given to the poor. And this is where we get the side note coming from verse 6 that Judas was the one who kept the common purse, the treasury for what was going on, and had been already stealing from it. Jesus then states in verse 7 that leave her alone. Let her do this as she then is preparing for my burial. And recognizing that in verse 8, you will always have the poor with you. You will not always have me. And then partially why he says that in verse 8 is going back to verse 5, where Judas is stating that the money from the perfume can be sold to be able to be given to the poor. So this idea of Jesus talking about recognizing the value of the day, recognizing how things aren't always going to be the way that we anticipate them being, and thus having to adjust and being willing and accepting of that change as things are coming. And so recognizing all of that. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and thinking about these texts in a unique and different way. And sometimes that's the hardest part. Being able to look and hear different commentaries can really help spark different ideas and really bring forth new and different ways of thinking about it. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, purely to get some of the different commentaries and discussions that are going on over there, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have art, prayers, hymns, and liturgical colors. But I think most importantly, especially as we are still in the season of Lent and moving into some other seasons that are coming up quickly, I think the daily devotions is also a great resource to have there. I know in particular, if you are really wanting to dig deep into Holy Week, which I am not going to go through and do every day of Holy Week, I know Vanderbilt does a great job at having all the text for every day of Holy Week. So if that's something that would be interesting to you, I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter covering a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into your weekly preaching, along with some different ideas to be thinking about to be maybe more eco-friendly and to joy in some of the homilies that are going on for a lot of these weekly texts. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. Finally, I also highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Adolphus Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp. I'm really excited about it as they are doing it again this year from June 21st through the 27th. And as I've stated before, I have gone to this before. It's an amazing way to talk about breaking science. How does that tie to our faith? How does ethics fit in with all of that? And I'm in discussions. I will plan on being there for at least part of it. And I'm really excited about that possibility. It's geared toward high school students. So if you know of a high school student who is looking for something fun and different and interactive this summer, I'd highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Adolphus Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp. And I think you're going to find an amazing resource there. When we are looking at these texts, it's an interesting interplay that we are in, and especially kind of the curveball that we get between the Philippians text and the John text this week. A lot of the texts are really getting to the heart of that we are called within faith to live in the moment, which is a little counterintuitive in certain ways. But we are called to make sure that we are living in today. We're not getting caught up in the past. We're not getting caught up in the future. We are staying present to where we are today. Then we have the Philippians text where Paul is also then talking about the recognition of what Christ has done for us, influences who we are today, and how then we are going to continue moving forward and letting go of things that may have defined us previously. So suddenly Paul is taking this idea and building upon it, recognizing the aspect of how we have things that we have to continue to depend on God, that God is going to continue in the nature of who God is. And in doing that, that is what we can build upon. And in the spirit of spring, in the spirit of going through this season of Lent, there is this idea of how we need to persevere. We need to be able to get through this, but not get ahead of ourselves, but not look back, stay in the moment. And that's difficult. But we're also in spring, where we're in the season of growing. We're in the season of anticipation. We're in the season of thinking about growth. And that's where I want to talk a little bit about plants. Specifically, we're going to focus more on flowering plants this week, and we're going to talk about that there is two major categories. We'll briefly touch on a third category that we typically find with plants. And there's pros and cons to both of these. And in doing that, I think we can end up bringing this all back around to understanding what a little bit Paul is getting at, and how do we then follow through with what Christ is calling us to do while continuing to build for something much deeper than just the here and now. So when we're going to a nursery and we're thinking about plants for the spring and we're thinking about getting our hands dirty in the dirt, there is basically two, you could argue a third type of plant that you can get. You can get annuals, you can get biennials, or you can get perennials. An annual plant is going to spend all its energy focused on this year. This would be an example of like petunias or zinnias or marigolds. They are purely focused on this year. They're a 1-year plant. They're going to put forth a lot of time and effort. Their seed production at the end of their life is great, but it's mostly for we're trying to get the most out of this year. And typically they're a little bit more showy plants because they're taking all that energy and they're shooting it into making sure that there is enough for them to be able to reproduce and produce the seed for the end of the year so that their offspring in the future are able to continue to grow. They're not going to see any of it. It is all about this year, this moment. That is what an annual is about. Then we have biennials, which takes the annual model and says we need just a hair more time. We need a little bit more time to be able to maybe grow an onion, or we need just a little bit of time. So we're talking now maybe 2 growing seasons instead of 1, that we're going to spend some time. We're going to develop a little bit of a root, but we're really going to be we're trying to produce these and we just need a little bit longer growing season. And that's where the second growing season comes in. So it's basically an offshoot of your annual plants that it's going to take just a little bit more time for them to grow. Then we have our perennials, and perennials are ones that can have multiple growing cycles, can have multiple seeds production. You can think of tulips or asters, but you can also think of like a lot of your berries. So blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, blackberries. If you want to go into more like trees, you can think of like apple trees or a lot of your different fruit trees like pears or plums. These trees continue to produce fruit year after year once they are established. It takes a little bit more time for them to be able to establish. They're going to go through and take some effort for that establishing period. This means that they might put them in the ground and not initially get fruit right away. It might take a few years for that to end up happening. And they're not going to take and put all their energy every year into the fruit. They recognize if there's something that's not going well, they'll shut things down. They'll just not produce as much fruit that year and recognize that there's another day, there's another year, there's another growing season. It's okay. We can continue to take and harvest, and we're going to bank on next year being that year. 2 very different approaches to how you're going to be doing things. Technically 3, but let's put the biennials in with those annuals. It's basically just an offshoot of it, but very different perspectives. And it's interesting that we're looking at the text this week and we're talking about how Christ is calling us into the moment. Christ is calling us into this time of we need to be thinking about the here and now. I'm not always going to be here with you. But we also think about how much Christ has also talked about thinking about what's coming and planning for that. When we look at these 2 differing styles of how plants grow, I think we need to take the elements of both and realize that we need both in order for us to have the joy that we are promised in the Isaiah text this week. In order for us to be able to live in the moment and recognize that God is going to continue to provide, we also need to have the root system to recognize the depth of what Christ is doing and being able to take that and actually move forward with it. And that is a big task in and of itself. We don't think of it that way, but that is true. When you think about what is a perennial doing that an annual isn't, a perennial is putting down roots. A perennial is making sure that its root system can provide. It's the annual doesn't do that. And I'll attach a paper down below. One of the things that research has shown, especially as we've done a lot of monoagriculture with especially looking at like corn, for instance, of a single monocrop that's an annual plant, is how that affects not only the soils, but also the water and how that's transferred, because it's not a long-term resident. The soil then and their root system isn't going deep. It's not holding deep down. It's more surface level. But what is Christ getting at? Christ is recognizing that life is temporary at the same time, and is also calling us to make sure that we don't get so obsessed with just having the deep root system that we actually miss what is going on in the current moment. We need to be able to both flower for now, to be able to show and talk about the gospel and what it all means, while still putting energy into our root system to continue to grow and be an annual plant. Christ is calling out the idea that, yes, in this moment, as he is preparing for the cross, he is getting into more of a short-term mindset, but is also trying to call his disciples to recognize the beauty of what is going on and not ridicule people that they're one or another, recognizing that you need both. As we are walking this faith out, we need both the deep roots that an perennial will give us, but also have the energy to going into the here and now that an annual brings just as much. The downside to a perennial, as we talked about, is if the year is rough, it's easier for them to shut down. This is a great example of this is a lot of your fruit trees. If you get a late frost in the spring, they just might say, okay, yeah, we'll grow leaves. We just won't have a ton of fruit because we killed all the apple blossoms in order for the apples to grow. And what does that affect? The effect is then there isn't any flowers for the pollinators to end up using to be able to produce honey or be able to pollinate other plants. And thus it does have a trickle-down effect. And as we talked about, the good thing that perennials bring is they have the root structure to be able to help hold an ecosystem together. So there's your pro and your con. The annual, as we've talked about, doesn't have that root structure, but it's also going to, no matter what, it's going to do its best and take all the energy it can and put out that flower. But what does that also mean? It's utilizing more resources. And that can be very difficult on the soil because it's constantly looking and trying to suck up everything. If we're not putting down a fertilizer, because that root system isn't deep, it's not going to get very far. So what does this all have to mean? Especially when we're thinking about what Paul is talking about. Paul starts understanding it's easy for us to get caught up in who or whose we've been. Specifically, like when he is talking about the tribe of Benjamin and going through his whole family tree, it's really possible to get caught up in that and forget that we're also supposed to be living in the moment here today. And I think there is plenty of churches that I think that is one of our biggest struggles, is our history, and that we are dragging our history along with us instead of our history empowering us to move forward, continue to write the future. But I'd also argue, which is kind of in the subtext of, I feel, what Paul is writing here in the Philippians text, is that, yes, what Christ did is empowering us to move forward boldly. But that still means with what Paul is talking about, there is roots to what Paul is discussing. Paul has taken the time to understand to some extent what this actually means and is continuing in his writings to deepen that understanding and continuing to ponder it to continue to grow deeper, but then taking that inspiration to share it outward again. It's a great example of Luther's inner and outer person that is happening here in the Philippians text. And the reason that we're getting this juxtaposed with this John text is Jesus has done a lot of the heavy root stuff throughout his ministry. And now we're getting toward the end, and Jesus is saying, now is the time where I am shifting to this short-term focus, but you need to be doing both simultaneously. We can't get caught up in just being a perennial faith and that we're going deeper and deeper with our roots, that we forget about what's going on currently, that we don't ever flower. But if we only are flower and no substance in the soil, there isn't the depth to be able to maintain through the storms of life that will come. And there's definitely other faith traditions that I would argue have that problem just as much. So what is the solution to this? The solution is we need to take the aspects of both. We need to be able to stop and smell the flowers and take that time and recognize what Christ is doing for us and what God has done for us. and give God praise and not forget about that aspect. We can't be just the people who are planning for the future. We have to be a people who also live in the current moment. But we are not a people who only live in the current moment. We need to be able to be inspired and filled with what has happened and continue to plan for the future, but also still have that element of the current time as well. It is a very difficult balance, but I think it's something that we really do need to be reflecting on a lot. I think it's really easy as church communities, but also as individuals, for us to fall into the traps of focusing on one of these or two of these, but not all three. Recognizing that our history does not define our present or our future. Our present doesn't negate what has happened in our past or what will happen. And our future does not purely just go off of what has happened in the past or what we're currently going through at the current moment. But yet they're all related. I think that's what Christ is really trying to get at here. It's not that Jesus is saying don't ever care about the poor, by no means. It's just that also don't forget what Christ is doing. And sometimes you need to be able to treasure that as well. So the question I have for you this week is, how do you see the past, the present, and the future working together in your life and influencing what's going on in your life? It's a deep and hard question, but again, that's what Lent is all about. There's definitely ways when I look at my life and the way that my life has gone that it doesn't seem linear. But yet when you go through it and talk through it and I start bringing up key points, there's connection points to how I got to where I am and where I am going. And I even know in my life, there is definitely times where I've gotten focused on different aspects of the two where I don't do a good job at taking all three together. And I think that's partially why we need to have young people continue to help us with this. Because I think young people in a lot of ways do a good job as they get older, recognizing the past is the past. And yes, it does influence things, but it also doesn't define who I am currently. And it doesn't necessarily need to define who I will be. And it helps them continue to dream and think about what can be. It seems like somewhere along the lines, at times we get worn down by life and suddenly then we just start getting complacent. And the scary thing with that is we're not really truly becoming perennials. We're not truly becoming annuals. We're just kind of being. And that's kind of the scariest of all of it. We need to continue to live in the moment of now while looking to the future and being informed by our past. Recognizing that God has and will continue to provide for us. Continuing to deepen that relationship with God, but also not getting so caught up in our future that we forget the present, because those are the moments where we actually minister. We can't minister in the past. That's already happened. We can't minister in the future. We're not there yet. We only minister in the moment, the present. And I think it's really easy for us to get caught up in the other ends of that and not get to the present. Doesn't mean that we don't lay down roots and try working and figuring out ways to have things that are establishing and growing that are going to actually give us sustainable root structures to be able to have long-term feeding like a perennial. But we also need to be able to show and walk out the faith well, like an annual. We need to be the ultimate hybrid plant that puts forth beautiful flowers every year as an annual, but yet has the root system of a perennial, but is willing to take the energy and put it all out there in the moment. We need to stop and smell the roses, not be worried about the next meeting that we need to get to. And in a world that I think has gotten to more hustle and bustle and more to-dos and more things that I need to get done or run here or run there, bring someone here, bring someone there, we have to remember that a part of our calling is to be in the moment. And the moment isn't always scheduled. It's work to be both an annual and a perennial, and especially for the type of work that we are called into, it's very difficult. But nowhere did it say that this was going to be an easy ministry for us, because we know that our time is short. And the scary thing is we don't know how long that is. So we have to continue to do all three, like the 3-in-1 that we come to and worship every week. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.